Hi guys, welcome to the next talk on Joshua, and I've got a question for you. Do you want to be effective in the service of God? I hope you do, I'm sure you do, and there are lots of things that we can kind of focus on or think about to perhaps ask the question, well, how is that possible? How can a person be used by God? And you'll hear lots of answers, prayer, time with him in secret, and I think that's probably the key one. But there's other things that we can look at today, and that's what Joshua chapter 5 is all about. Now, I won't read the chapter. I'm hoping that you've read it before, but I'm just going to go through a few thoughts with you now, and then we can maybe knock about a few questions on Sunday in our Zoom meeting, which we'll be even better at this week, I'm sure. So, here we go. So, I want you to imagine that you're a soldier in a small team and you're being attacked by a large force. You're dug in and you're down to your last 50 bullets. What are you going to do? Your future depends very much on your commanding officer, doesn't it? And he might say to you, right lads, right people, wait until you see the whites of their eyes before you pull the trigger. As Israel stands on the edge of Canaan, are they ready? Ready to drive through this land like a hot knife through butter? Maybe. As the church was filled with purity and power at Pentecost, were they ready? Were they ready to be Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth? As missionaries like William Carey set out for India, was he ready? He said, God's mission done God's way cannot fail but to have God's blessing. What about us? Are we effective in the Lord's service? Will my life make a lasting difference in time and eternity? Well, God has the power. You can see that in verse 1 where it says, when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan, their hearts sank and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. God has the power. The question is, will he pour out his power and his blessing on us? Well, I want to encourage you to think about this God this morning, and maybe it'll encourage you to answer that question. Yes, he can and he will. So first of all, remember this. We know the Lord who purifies and pardons. So in verses 2 to 9, we get this. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again. Now you think, whoa, circumcision, what on earth has that got to do with us? Well, it was a sign done on the male babies, 8 days old, that they belong to God. It was a physical sign of hopefully a spiritual reality. It was the cutting away of sin and ownership by God. It was a mark that God owned that person. And the problem is that nobody had done it for 40 years. All the time the Israelites were wandering in the desert, they had not done this command. And why? Well, it was because they were still under God's judgment. They were still under his discipline. 40 years previously, they'd failed to enter the land. They disbelieved and God had judged them. If you like, the desert was God's way then of giving them a faith workout, a spiritual gymnasium, to teach them to really trust him. He led them, he fed them, but nobody was circumcised. They were still under his discipline. And verse 6 makes a very shocking statement because it says that God's promise was cancelled by another promise of God. So verse 6, it says, the Lord had promised to them that they would not see the land that he'd solemnly promised their fathers. So he said, I promise you that I'm not going to give you the promise I promised. What's going on? Well, God's promise was conditional. Israel, you can enjoy this land if you trust and obey. And I'm reminded of verses like 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul lists all of the Old Testament history. And he's writing to a church in Corinth, people who say Jesus is Lord, but were very casual about their sin. And they were overconfident that because they were so spiritual, sin didn't really affect them. And Paul says, wait. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, he says, these things, these Old Testament stories, happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us. So this is a warning and encouragement to us. And if you read 1 Corinthians 10, you'll see that Paul says things like this, don't long for material things. Love nothing more than Christ. Be morally pure. Don't tempt Christ by doubting his mercy or doubting his love. Never grumble against God, his ways, or his people. That's all the things the Corinthians were doing. And I think we can probably do those things as well. And maybe we're stuck in our houses at the moment. We're forced to reflect and think. And we have to ask, what is really important to me? And I think we're being challenged here. Is my health the most important thing to me? Is my health even more important to me than Christ? Now I speak that to myself as well. Of course, we want to be healthy. Good health is a blessing from God. But we must beware. Of course, we're other things as well. We need God's mercy. We need God's pardon. And look what God says in verse 9. When Joshua ultimately comes to God and the Israelites are all circumcised, it's a mark of trust and obedience to God. Verse 9, God says this, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. All that 40 years, when you failed, these 40 years that I've been leading you, they've come to this point where you trust me, you fulfill and obey, as it were, you submit to the covenant, you get circumcised, your reproach is rolled away. And of course now we come to Christ. We come in faith to the Saviour who was crucified and who rose again. And it could be 40 years, 40 minutes, 40 seconds. But we come to him and we trust in his mercy and forgiveness, and he purifies us and pardons us. Maybe this week has been a bad week for you. Perhaps you feel guilty about things. We know the Lord who purifies and pardons us. If you've been forgiven, you can be effective for God. So secondly, we know the Lord who provides. So verses 10 to 12, we're told this story here about how that day God gives them food from the land for the first time in 40 years. And the next day, the manna stops. That's a big thing. 40 years of food. That's a contract and a half, isn't it? What's a mighty miracle? God fed his folks supernaturally for 40 years, and now it stops. Has God stopped providing for his people, though? No. Now they're eating the food out of the land. Now, which is more miraculous? The manna from heaven, or the daily provision of food out of the ground? Which is more miraculous, that God should drop a box of cornflakes out of the sky, or that we can buy it from Morrison's? Well, I guess you could say, yeah, all right, Adam, you're being silly now. But I'm making a serious point that the everyday provision of God is in many ways just as miraculous, just as supernatural as being fed by manna. Most of God's gifts, writes one person, most of God's gifts are not wrapped in tinsel, but in brown paper. Quiet provisions of safety, almost unseen. Health of children, picking up our salary at the end of the month. Meals with loved ones, all in an ordinary day's work for a providing God. All in an ordinary day's work for God. Our God provides. So here's an encouragement to serve him. If he purifies us and pardons us, we're clean, we're right, that's our great motive for serving him, forgiveness. But secondly, God provides. Here's a great security we have for serving him. I can trust him. I can obey him, leave the consequences to him, and not fear. So God has cleansed me. I want to serve him. And God keeps me. I want to serve him. You're going to be effective for God? Well, if you know this God, that's a great encouragement for you. So we know God's pardon, and we know God's providing. Third thing, last thing, we know God's prince, or commander, if you prefer. Verse 13 to 16, we have an amazing story here. Joshua was by Jericho, and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Now, the Hebrew is very, very stop-start here. It's very staccato. It's basically things like, it's little bit like this. Joshua by Jericho. He lifted his eyes. He looked. Behold, a man opposite him, a sword in hand. It's almost in slow motion. We're being drawn to this strange man that we've never met before. He's startling. He's mysterious. And Joshua's strange question, whose side are you on? Are you for us or for our enemies? Who do you serve? Strange question. But the answer is strange as well. Nope. I mean, in our Bible it says neither, but it's literally no. So Joshua says, who do you serve, us or our enemies? And this man says no. Joshua, that's the wrong question. Who are you to invite me onto your team? I belong to no one. I belong to myself. I'm not going to be squeezed into your box, Joshua. Your plans, your desires, no. I am the commander of the hosts of the Lord Almighty, and I have come. That word commander means prince, ruler. It's someone who leads forces on behalf of the great king. And this guy leads God's supernatural armies. This is God's prince. So Joshua, the commander on earth, must bow to this commander from heaven. Now Joshua, I think, might not quite realise who this is. But his language suggests that he's got a fairly good idea. He says, my Lord. What message does my Lord have for my servant? And then he falls on his face to the ground, and he takes off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. Heaven has come to earth. God's commander has come down. This is God in human form. I would say this is a visitation of God the Son before he became Jesus. His sword is ready for battle, and his army is greater and more mighty than all the hosts that they're about to face. So what more is there to do but fall down and worship? If we are conquered by Jesus, we can go and conquer for Jesus. We're back to this idea of reverence, awe, fear, trust, love, submission, having our minds blown away by the awesomeness of Jesus. Christ stands with eyes of fire, with a sword in his hands. You can read it in Revelation. And this sword that cuts and divides my soul right down to the joints and the marrow. He knows me to my core. Christ slams his feet on every square inch of this universe and he shouts out, "This is mine." What should we do? Christian, fall down and worship Jesus. But you see, if we've been conquered by Christ, we can conquer for Christ. So do we know this prince, this commander? So if we know God's pardon, we're clean. There's our motive. If we know his provision, there's our security. We don't need to fear as we serve him. We can step out and fear him. And if we know his prince, if we can be blown away by him, then we follow him. He says go, we go. So just to wrap things up, Jericho is waiting. Chapter 6, verse 1. Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. That's a pretty impossible thing to do. Who cares? It matters not one tiny bit. God purifies and pardons us. God provides everything we need, and God sends his own prince to command us. Who cares how tall the walls of Jericho are? They're doomed. Will my life amount to anything for Christ? Anything at all? That all depends on whether I know Joshua's God. Have I allowed him to utterly crucify my sin and pardon me through his death on the cross? Do I see his personal and perfect provision for me every day? Then I trust him to press on. And have I seen the Prince in his glory, mighty to save, mighty to conquer, mighty to triumph? Then I follow him. Then my life can amount to something. Who knows what opportunities we'll have in these next few weeks? We need to use them, don't we? At the age of just 19 years old, and with this I'll close, Jonathan Edwards, a student in New England in America, wrote these resolutions, he called them, promises. He wrote them in his diary. He wrote 37. I'm just going to give you 4. Number 1, resolved that I will do whatever I think to be most to God's glory and my own good, the whole of my life, without any consideration of the time, now, or ages to come. I am resolved to do this, whatever difficulties I face. Glory of God. Okay. Next one is number 5. Resolved never to lose a single moment of time. Wow. 6. Resolved to live with all my might while I live. That's a good one, isn't it? Live with all my might because of Christ. And lastly, his 7th resolution out of 37, resolved never to do anything which I should be afraid to do if it were the last hour of my life. Wow, challenge. So, are you ready? Jericho is waiting. God pardons us, God provides for us, and God's Prince leads us.